Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning and good evening. It's a pleasure to have you here. And welcome to a session that is under the title From Analysis to Impact, Connecting Climate and Development in Over 40 Countries. The background of it is that the World Bank is not about only financing, climate financing, but it's also about good analytics. And we feel we need to have good analytics to make an impact. And we have started a whole series of country climate and development reports that is trying to evaluate policy options for governments, particularly as they go having short-term challenges, as well as to see how that path to net zero by 2050 is evolving and what challenges the country may face. We started that series last year. Last year in Egypt, we presented a first summary report. We have now a second synthesis report that we will present in a moment. But before we do that, let me introduce also the panelists who have kindly agreed to join me here. And first on video is Mr. Nicolas Kazadi, the Minister of Finance of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Merci bien pour avoir accepté l'invitation de nous accompagner dans cette discussion. And then we have João Paulo Resenda. He's the Special Advisor for Climate Change Economics in the Ministry of Finance of Brazil. And as you know, Brazil has assumed the G20 presidency, so welcome. And then we have Jennifer Saar. She's our Director for Climate Finance, has been working day and night to get ready for this. But it is very good that she can also share a little bit some of the reflections on the CCDRs. And before I turn questions to the three panelists, let me invite Stefan Hallegatte. He's our guru, or senior advisor, but he's actually the guru of the CCDRs. He has been overseeing all this work from a qualitative point of view and has given the intellectual guidance. So, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Axel, and it's really a great pleasure to be with you today to discuss our second country climate and development report summary. This year, the topic has been development, climate, and nature in crisis. And this year, our report will be based on 42 economies covered by our CCDRs. So it's about twice as many as we had last year. So let me start briefly with a little bit of our progress covering low and middle income countries. We started a year ago with country climate and development reports. Now we have reports covering more than half of the population in low and middle income countries. We have about 3/4 of the GDP of those countries. In terms of emissions, we cover 2/3, but also 2/3 of the disaster losses of the last 20 years. And the novelty in this second wave of CCDRs is that we now cover 56% of tropical forests. We had only 10% last year, so we have a big change here. What I will show you today is main findings of a global report, which is trying to pull together the findings of all of those CCDRs. And I want to say it's not your average global report. This is based on individual CCDRs with individual teams, individual quality control, individual engagement in each of the countries. And what we're doing is to pull all that together in this global piece. So I'll show you 5 main messages, and I know you're never supposed to have more than 3, but there's so much value and so much content and granularity in those reports, we ended up with 5. So bear with me, I will go very briefly through those 5 points. The first one is the synergy we see between development and resilience. We need development, we need poverty reduction to make people resilient. You cannot be resilient if you're living in extreme poverty and you don't have access to basic services. But at the same time, we need resilience to safeguard development gains and not to just walk them back every time we have a crisis. What we find in CCDRs is that countries have readily available opportunities to improve people's lives, health, safety, with interventions that boost adaptation and resilience. And just to illustrate this point about those investment opportunities in adaptation and resilience, here you see economic impacts in a few of the CCDR countries with current policies and with our recommendation in terms of adaptation and resilience. And basically, you can gain between 2 and 8 percentage points of GDP thanks to those interventions. So it's a really good investment. What we find is that the private sector is not investing enough, and that's largely because of a lack of supportive legal framework and the right financing tools. But the private sector could play much a bigger role here. And we also find that even if you assume perfect adaptation, if you do everything right, you cannot cancel all impacts of climate change, which means adaptation is important. It cannot replace a reduction in global emissions, which of course have to start with high-income countries and the biggest emitters. Speaking about low carbon development, we're looking at low emission scenarios in all of the countries, and we find that we can have this low carbon development with the same or even faster economic growth. But that depends on many conditions. You need the right enabling environment. You need the policies to be well designed. You need to take care of the losers in the transition. And you need more support, finance, and technologies from high-income countries. So again, just as an illustration of this point, here you see the impact of moving to low-carbon development in our CCDRs. And you see for all income levels, from low income to high income, we have our first CCDR in high-income countries in Romania this year. You see that in most countries, what we have is a faster GDP growth in those scenarios. And that's because of all of the synergies we find with cheap renewable energy, energy efficiency, for instance, clean cooking and its impact on health. A lot of those synergies together means that we can do more growth with less carbon. You see also that for consumption, things are a little bit more balanced. We have some places where we have a loss in consumption, and it reminds us that we need to take care of the impact, especially on the poorest, and the reports go into the toolbox to do that. It can be labor policy, it can be social protection, it can be transition roadmaps, but this is an important part of the picture. Our third message is completely focused on the role of the private sector. So the private sector has a key role to play to meet investment needs in resilience and low carbon development. But it's not only a question of private capital. It's also bringing innovation, technologies, inventing new business models we need to be more efficient. And that, again, requires policies, a change in the institutional and legal framework. But it can also be supported by concessional finance, especially to mitigate some of the risks. And we're talking about credit risks, foreign exchange risks, or market risks. When it's needed, concessional finance can help the private sector step in. This is an estimate from our CCDRs of how much investment you need to make development more resilient and low carbon. And so we have more countries than last year, but the key message is the same. For upper middle income countries, it's a manageable increase, like 1–2% of their GDP. If you go toward lower income countries, the challenge becomes much more complicated, and those countries will need more help. What we see also is that those investments do not only bring more resilience and less carbon, they also bring better development, better health, better quality of life. Our reports are looking at the role of the private sector to meet those needs. What you see here is from sectors going from industry at the top to water at the bottom, how much CCDR assess we can have the private sector invest and meet those investment needs. In some sectors, like industry, it's mostly private, of course. In some sectors, you can see water, it's mostly public. But what you see also is in many sectors, it really depends on the country. And if you look at CCDRs themselves, as I'm sure you will do, you'll see that it's very different, the recommendations in different countries, because countries start with very different places. My fourth message is on spending better, because we're talking quite a lot about how much more investment we need, but our CCDRs also identify opportunities to spend better the resources we have already. And that's a really important part of the discussion. Of course, we discuss about repurposing subsidies in energy, water, or agriculture so that they can achieve the same development and socioeconomic gains, but in a more efficient way, more efficient for public finance, more efficient for the environment. We also talk about trade policy reforms, and we flag the obstacles, which are largely political economy obstacles. So just to illustrate this point, we looked at all of the recommendations in CCDRs, and we classified them between the ones that require more spending and the ones about spending better. And you can see here, for countries at all income level again, about half of our recommendations do not require more resources. They require a better use of these resources, and it's a really important point. And finally, my last message, I told you at the beginning that now we cover more than half of tropical forests in the world. We identify a lot of opportunities linked to land use and forestry. In just 5 CCDR countries, those policies could reduce emissions by 3 gigatons of CO2 per year. It's about 6% of the way to net zero. But we also identify the challenges, and challenges at the domestic level, but also the need to secure a way to get international payments for the services that those forests bring to the population at the global level. So just to give you a sense of what we're looking at, on the left, you see with current policies what we expect to see in terms of forest area in the world. In those CCDRs, we're talking about a loss by 50 million hectares. On the right, you see those low emission scenarios with instead a gain by 7 million hectares. So it's a more than 60 million hectare difference, and that would, on total, over the whole period, we're talking about 60 gigatons of CO2 of emissions that could be avoided just in those countries. But what CCDR's flag is, it's not only something that will be achieved with forestry policies. It's much more of a whole of economy challenge. If you want to ensure people have alternative jobs, food security, and a project for the development, you need also to look at agriculture, you need to look at services, you need to look at a full development plan, and not only at the forestry sector. So I'll stop here. It's a lot of content, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our panel. Thanks again for your attention.
Thank you, Stefan. What the study has in common with this session is that we are out, that time is not on our side. And so for the panelists, what I will suggest that your answers are limited to about 3 minutes so that we can go to two rounds. So just, we cannot cover everything. So let me first go to Kinshasa, to Mr. Kasadi, and ask him about how useful have these CCDRs been for your country, identifying the problems, but also helping this internal discussion to look for policy options to improve climate policies in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Over to you.
Thank you, Axel. And thank you for the invitation to join this important event. Yes, the CCDR is very, very relevant for us for many reasons. We have launched our last month in Kinshasa, and clearly it is aligned with our vision supported by our national adaptation strategy. As you know, we call DRC a very important country when it is related to climate challenges. Because for me, we consider that there is no difference between development challenges and climate challenges, especially for a country like DRC, with what it represents in terms of forest, in terms of clean energy potential, and in terms of strategic minerals. So for all this, it is clear that we have to work effectively. And this CCDR is bringing us very clear views on options. And it comes at a very good time because we are starting a new development cycle, starting next month, next year in January. And this will completely impact our new development plan for the next 5 years. What we get as findings on CCDR is first that we cannot remain in action because inaction for our country will affect our growth, and we may lose 4 to 2% of domestic gross product by 2050, and we may, if we remain in inaction, we may put an additional 16 million people into poverty. So clearly, we need to work, and as you said, we need to work fast. And again, we consider our country like a solution country, so we don't have any time to waste on forest protection and also on energy. We have a big divide on energy supply. All these are affecting forests, are affecting development. We have a big divide on all that is regard to infrastructure. And that means that clearly we need a big push in investment. And we already know that this investment can not only come from the public sector, even if we are making tremendous effort these years, and we need to speed up our reform agenda to have a better business environment to attract good investors. Not the potential projects that are missing, it's only a matter of legal framework and reforms that can attract good investors to speed up. So what I can say is that the time for us is to consolidate what we have started in recent years, to deepen our reforms, and to accelerate those reforms to produce growth, and this growth should rely on both public and private investment. All these elements, we find them in the CCDR, and especially on energy, we have the biggest potential in clean energy in Africa. With INGA, for example, the INGA development, and I think now time has come to go into action, and we don't have any reason, internally or at the world level, to delay again such a project, which is a big contribution to the protection of forests, the development of Africa on a basis that is climate friendly.
Thank you very much. I think we get your message of urgency, but also of huge investment needs, but also huge opportunities, as you just mentioned, for example, that the INGA project could mean for your country. Let me now turn to João and ask you a little bit about how you see the value of the CCDRs in the case of Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Axel. Thank you for having me here, for the invitation. You know, as of the very beginning of the current administration, Brazilian government, Mr. Fernando Haddad, which is the Minister of Finance, asked a few of his advisors to draft up a plan to tackle climate change associated with development, with precisely the wording that Stefan used here, which is a whole of economy approach. And my colleagues had been working on this. I came in a little later, since the very beginning, and drafting up a plan. And by May or June, I was already part of the team, and I was introduced to country director, Mr. Zoot, by Ms. Svetlanka here at Belém, where COP30 is going to be. And for a German, he we started talking about this development plan. He's Dutch, right? Not German, my fault. It's very similar to, it's just like Brazilians and Argentinians for you guys. Very different, by the way, very different. So Mr. Zoot mentioned, well, you don't need a plan because it's all in there. You know, kind of like joking. And I didn't believe him because I wasn't aware that the report had come out already in May. This was June or July, I think. So I went there and took a look, and I was impressed. I was impressed because I would say 80% of what we were doing through a completely independent route was exactly what was at the CCDR. Of course, there's a little bit more there, which I believe has to do with the way we see how development in Brazil should go on. But all the major targets and the most pressing issues were reflected, very well, precisely reflected at the CCDR. And so you could tell, so you don't need it. It's unnecessary. So not exactly, because there's two important things here. The first one, actually there's three, I think. The first one is there is a lot of quantification that we hadn't done yet, and we're still doing, and it's in there. So that was helpful. You can see by Stefan's presentation how deep the analysis is. Second, it gave us a reassuring feeling that we were on the right path, and that was important because sometimes
Yeah.
you're doing these things and you think you're alone, thinking, is this really something workable? Is this really, am I being foolish here to try this? And then you see that reflected in the World document that gives us a lot of reassurance, and also reassurance, and then that's the third aspect, to the public speech to the country, because, you know, this is, again, this is not a crazy idea. This is something that can be done. This is something that needs to be done, and it has the expertise, it has the support of such a renowned institution like the World Bank. So it's easier to sell the plan having that support from the World Bank. So this is the story.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, what you add to what I just mentioned in the case of Congo is maybe the validation value. That what also is important is that maybe some of the comparative and then also quantification parts that are important. Let me now turn to Jennifer. Now you have seen 38 CCDR being published for 42 countries. When you look a little bit around them and you get feedback, what are some of the 3-4 points that you are hearing often in the dialogue, what you think was valued, and where you see maybe some new challenges?
No, thank you. That's a great question, and very much just building on the two previous speakers. I mean, the appreciation for the deep analysis and the quantification, and that's very, very important. But also that the results are showing that you can deliver climate and development together, and I think that's very, very important. And so the additional value of the World Bank having done 38 countries, 38 CCDRs in 42 countries, is that's a global knowledge exchange. So we can look at what's working in one country, what we've learned from one country, where we might have high emissions trajectory and a country with low emissions trajectory, and trends with countries with high forestation levels, and how do you share lessons across big countries and small countries? Is that not working? Okay, thanks. So that's the important thing, is the global knowledge. How do you take the global knowledge of the deep analytics? But most importantly, I think, is translating it back into the country. So these are bank documents that are prepared with the country, but then how the country can internalize them. And as you mentioned that, and so it's really how do you incorporate them into your long-term strategies, into your NDC's long-term strategies, and translate and operationalize the CCDRs. And through the CCDRs, bring in other stakeholders in the country, the private sector, the public sector, the community groups, so that there is an all-of-economy and all-of-society approach as you prepare your climate and development pathways. And that's very, very important, to bring the global knowledge, but how do you operationalize it in the country? And then from there, what are the most important policy reforms that you could take, and what are the most impactful investments? And that's another area where just sharing across countries that really you can leapfrog over looking at successful policy actions that work in one country and be able to implement them in another country. So for example, in Uzbekistan, after the CCDR, one of the actions the government took was to do major policy reform on gas subsidies. So repurposing gas subsidies. So there's different examples of ways that you could take a policy lesson from one country to another. You could take operation, again, what investment programs work the best, and how do you crowd in and leverage different forms of investment to achieve the biggest impact from the CCDR.
Thank you. Let me now go to a second round. And as you heard from Stefan in his presentation, this second round has a lot more on forestry. Maybe last year we didn't have so many countries covered with important forest challenges. This time around, it's much more comprehensive. So I would like to turn back to Kinshasa as the minister, how he sees the opportunities and also the challenges for the forestry in your country.
Yes, sure, excellent. Forests in DRC are a very good blessing for the country and also an opportunity for our development and climate challenges. Our forest contains around 85 gigatons of CO2 accumulated and stored. So our country is among the few countries that are a net carbon sink, removing estimated 822 megaton of CO2 per year. So it means that this shows how important it is to bring a good development, a sustainable development to the population if we want to keep those forests as an asset, not only for the country, but for the world. And this is the main challenge. Currently, we consider that our forests have a value estimated to 6.5 trillion of US dollars. If that is the case, it means that if we want to keep that asset for the world, for the sake of the world, we need to invest in this country. It is first our responsibility, but it is a world responsibility since we consider it as a world asset. That is the point. And on that, we can build best strategy to move on. What we see so far is that we are not making it as we should do it. For example, the last initiative that we signed at the COP26, I think, we raised $500 million 2 years ago, and so far we have been able to spend only 30 million US dollars out of that. It means that we have some problem. And as we said, we need, inaction will kill us. Not only the development of the DRC, but will impact the world on our climate challenges. And that is the main message that I can say. And the good news is that we have started moving in the right direction with the World Bank and some other key partners. The flows of ODA are growing. Reforms internally are moving in the good direction. We need to go a bit faster, but we can make it. And this country can absorb billions of dollars. It has a particularity. The debt ratio is very low, under 20%. So we have a lot of things to do.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to João. Now, with the government of President Lula, there are a lot of renewed focus on the forestry sector. So how do you see some of the challenges, but also the opportunities?
So yes, we have been remarkably able in a very short amount of time to reduce deforestation, as this number has been running around. They change every month because you measure every month, but the whole number that we're using is a reduction of 50% in deforestation in this year compared to the same period of last year, around 50%. So I'm emphasizing this because to point out that it's possible to be done, right? And as an opportunity, it's perhaps, for what I've seen so far, at least.
Can you just say how that was done?
Mostly by command and control mechanisms. So we still have not been able to implement large-scale incentives, payouts for people to preserve. And we're working on that, both nationally and internationally, because we believe, and this was one of the other points that I wanted to make, which is, forest standing. They pay out a service to the whole global community, not just to the country that holds that forest, because of the climate is interconnected, and many countries would be affected if, for example, the Amazon rainforest came down, completely down. So that's something that we've been trying to work with the international community. There's going to be briefly a session just the next hour in the Brazil Pavilion regarding to this. Minister Marina Silva, which is our Ministry of the Environment, will be announcing something along those lines. And that's an opportunity. And it's also an opportunity because, as I was going to say, for what I've been able to measure, the cheapest way to withhold carbon is by reducing deforestation, at least in Brazil. It's a lot cheaper than any energy alternative. It's a lot cheaper than any agricultural change of better practices and environmentally friendly practice. So it's cheaper that way, but it's also challenging because most of you, I don't know if many of you know, but it's large forest regions like the Amazon, and I'm sure like the Congo region in the DRC, are kind of like somewhat of a Wild West in terms of, property and titles and what belongs to whom and who has a right, for example, to be paid to conserve or to preserve. So this is the major challenge, and we'll need certainly, satellite imaging, artificial intelligence, all kinds of technology that we can use, and also a lot of human effort and this is the basics of any policy that you do, any regulation and any attempts to keep the forest standing. You have to find out who is responsible for certain parts of it, and that's perhaps the greatest challenge, I think.
Thank you. Let me turn to Jennifer, and again on the forestry. Maybe what are we doing? We do a little bit also on carbon credits. Maybe you say a word or two on that.
Yeah, I mean, on forestry, that is really important, and that's the question, how do you keep forests standing? I think in both these countries, it's a really, really important issue, and what are the incentives you could provide to communities to also to conserve the forests? So we've been doing, just before earlier this morning, we actually announced all the work that we've been doing on high-integrity carbon markets in the forestry sector. The World Bank's been working on this for more than 20 years, but we're finally coming to fruition in 15 countries where there are credits for countries themselves supporting them really to put in place these high integrity credits. And what does that mean? Just so you mentioned, the importance of all the environmental standards, the uniqueness, the permanence of the credits, how do you measure them, how do they accredited, but really importantly, the social standards. You mentioned property rights, which is one of the biggest challenges, but also looking at the indigenous populations who live in these forests. How do they also be able to benefit the communities, the benefit sharing plans? And that is actually very important. So actually what the bank's been doing for many, many years, we're small projects around the world, and we now have 15 countries where we've come to scale, where countries then can choose where they do generate these credits. Do they actually want to use the credits for their own NDCs, or do they also want to participate in the carbon markets, either Article 6 or the voluntary markets? And that's something the World Bank is supporting countries to help them, if they were, to choose to sell them, what's the best way that they could sell them. So the value of very, very high integrity credits in the forestry sector is something that is so incredibly important, especially for these two countries, that how do you maintain that integrity, how do you go to scale, and then how do you make sure you compensate the communities and the beneficiaries, and then again, how does it become part of the global solutions, and who's going to pay for these? Is it through carbon credits? Is it through other types of nature-based instruments?
Maybe a little of all of them, right?
Or they'll try everything together.
Yes.
But the integrity, Axel, is the most important part of the whole equation.
Well, thank you. We are running out of time, but one thing just to know, this was a general session to get us started on the CCDR discussions. We will have individual discussion of individual countries in the next couple of days. So please follow the agenda, and then you can attend that. Now, I will turn to all of them and ask for one sentence only what they expect. We started yesterday with a bang, I would say, and a very positive that the loss and damage fund was launched. The bank will provide the support in the creation of this financial intermediary fund. I think that is a good progress as of the start. But I just wanted to turn back to all of you, and starting in Kinshasa, what would be your hope of the outcome of this COP28? So, Minister Kazadi, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, the most important thing is to raise awareness, if needed, on the urgency to invest in DRC, not only to help the Congolese people, but to help the entire world. And as I mentioned, for the CCDR itself estimates that it requires $10 billion by 2035 of investment. A figure that we can compare with our 64 billions for adaptation and attenuation. Means that, as we repeatedly say, that it is very urgent to invest on the public basis and on private basis. And on the private basis, the potential for credit carbon is huge, but we need to invest on the way we manage the forest to get the best value of our credit capital. That is the main important message, and we have made some small progress in the recent years, but we need to accelerate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. João.
Right. I would say that it's important to keep in mind that forest preservation in low-income countries represent an opportunity cost. There are several economic activities that could be developed in those areas that will not be developed, and then people that live in those communities and in those regions will not have job opportunities and the ability to raise their income. So it's an international problem. It needs to be dealt internationally with the help of the international community. You cannot expect the country by itself to solve this problem related to forests. And I'll leave this as my only message.
Thank you. Jennifer.
So this is COP, and we came in a couple of weeks ago with a very dismal stock take, but then started, like you say, yesterday that the loss and damage fund will become operationalized, so that's good news. I think what the COP we really want to do is how do we come together to stay to the 1.5, stay to the Paris Agreement, and we also take into account all the adaptation and the needs, especially of the most vulnerable. So for us, it really is, let's not forget, COP is about negotiations. Countries are negotiating, and we want to stay within the 1.5 degrees.
Well, thank you very much. I think also what the CCDRs want to show is, yes, there is a huge problem, but we can deal with it. And you just mentioned there are opportunities. And I think what is necessary that this type of meetings also rally the support that we can actually do it, and that we also need to have the political willingness to organize the necessary resources for the investments that needs to be done. And hopefully we can make some progress. Let me express my appreciation to Mrs. Casadi for having taken the time in Kinshasa, but also João for joining, also Jennifer and all of you. Thanks for listening, but also join us in the country events where we discuss them more in detail, and then keep on pushing on the climate front. Thank you very much.
Thank you.